The great part about when the season ends is that the next season begins. So off-season scouting, planning for that next hunt, and really narrowing down where that mature buck that you're after and that big giant buck that you're after is actually at, and when he's going to present a time that you can actually hunt him is a great off-season activity, whether you're shed hunting, looking through your old trail cameras, scouting during the summer months. There's a lot of ways for you to figure out where that buck's at. And it all begins to me with, is he still alive? And so I have a hard time putting a lot of effort into a buck that I'm not really sure if he's there or not. You always be mindful of that. In fact, I'm trying to actually pattern several target bucks and really hoping that they're alive. But getting those late season trail camera photos and those trail cam photos going into the wintertime, the early winter, to me is the number one way to find that that buck is still alive, especially as it relates to your parcel and on your parcel. And so for me, I have my trail cameras out till April. Once the bucks start shedding, they're completely shed, they're starting to grow their new antlers, then I'm really watching those trail cameras up until that time, making sure he's there. But then once it gets to April, I'm pulling those trail cameras out of the woods, and I'm basically letting them soak till about June sometime, where we know we can identify those bucks. So to me, the trail cameras are all about not only figuring out where they're moving, the patterns that they're making, but then ultimately making sure that they're still alive. And then that blends in with my summer scouting too. Something that we're gonna blend into with this video that's very important in finding that next target buck and scouting that next target buck and making sure he's there is, for one thing, we're making sure he's alive. We'll do that during our summer scouting. But that starts to blend into the fact that these mature bucks, a lot of times you can put in two distinctly different categories. And one is you're getting that buck that he's there all the time during the hunting season. You see him, he's around shooting hours. He's consistently there. I call that a core buck. I named that this core and non-core bucks years ago, and really putting those two bucks in different categories. Then you have those non-core bucks that are random. They're not on your property very often. They're just there a little bit in October, maybe September. They're middle of the night. And there's different ways to hunt those bucks. But as it relates to scouting, I'm really trying to figure out, is this buck a core buck and a non-core buck? Because I hunt small properties, and you probably are yourself, and it might even be the small properties, 200 acres, 500 acres, but certainly my properties that I hunt are around 40 acres. I'm actually looking for one to purchase maybe this year that would be around 40 acres in size, and down to 20 acres, 8 acres. You know, a couple of properties that I hunt are 8 acres of cover, 30 acres, another one's 40. And so I'm making sure the buck's are alive. I'm leaving my cameras out. Winter cameras are so important for that. Summer scouting, you start to see a really familiar pattern, and that's if you have a great whitetail parcel in the fall, then those bucks are not there during the summer. The best summer whitetail parcels and mature buck parcels are not, and specifically talking about bucks, are not great fall parcels, and you see that happen time and time again. Those non-core bucks, those are the ones that do not live on your land, that aren't there all the time. You're getting random pictures in September and October. Let's face it, that's what a lot of parcels, a lot of hunters hunt. About half of my mature bucks, so I'd say roughly 12, 14 mature bucks have been non-core bucks, meaning they do not live on and around my land on a daily basis all hunting season long. And when it comes to identifying those bucks, some people might call them ghost bucks, non-core bucks. They're bucks that are not around your land. You wonder where they're at. And they're not often ghosts. They're not spending a lot of time on your property because they live somewhere else during the day. And so that non-core buck is a prime target though. And even though you only get a few pictures of most of my non-core bucks that I ultimately end up shooting, they're bucks that I had a handful of pictures over 2 or 3 years, and that's it. And so to get 20 pictures over 3 years of a non-core buck would be on the high side, but very defined buck that you can hunt. So you have the trail cameras, you have sign, you know how they move through your land based on the trail cameras, based on the sign, based on the deer trails. You can easily identify where these deer are coming through. But the number one way to scout for an off-season buck doesn't necessarily boil down to where he's moving through your property, what stand he's going by when. Those are all the easy parts. The number one scouting tool that you can define on the land, and for those mature bucks, those non-core bucks, is actually when they are actually on your property. By putting those bucks into two categories, non-core and core, it really helps narrow it down. You'll find the non-core bucks, they're probably going to be on your land only during the rut. They already have an area where they have does and fawns. They have an area that they can call home during September, October, especially after they shift out of their summer habitats into their fall. They have those locations. It's easier for them to find the first doe or two to breed. And then you can expect them to come onto your land during the middle of the hunting season. So you have to make sure that you scout, look over your trail cameras, summer footage, make sure those bucks are alive, winter footage, make sure that they're still on your trail cameras, and then you can actually fast forward and say, you know what, I've identified this buck. I've only had a handful of pictures. I know he's probably only going to come through during the rut, the peak of the rut. Around here in southwest Wisconsin, I hunt those bucks and shoot those bucks November 3rd, November 6th, November 7th, November 8th, the 12th, somewhere around in there during the peak of the rut. The non-core bucks, if I identify a buck as being that type of buck in that timing for the property, then I'm hunting those when the season begins up through the pre-rut. Pre-rut morning stands are my favorite, and I'm hunting those in and around the rut and all season long because they're an actual core buck that's in and around the property during shooting light the majority of the time and focusing on the property during the daylight. Those represent about half of the bucks that I shoot, and I usually shoot those before November 1st. So I'm shooting the non-core bucks after November 1st and then the core bucks before November 1st. So when you're scouting this off season, of course, we're already trying to figure out where they're moving through the land and why. They're moving from this bedding area to this bedding area during cruising hours. They're moving from bedding to feed. You're hunting those in the evening hours. You're hunting bedding areas in the morning. Those are all pretty much a given. But really, the success for your off-season scouting is placing those bucks into those two categories and making sure that you're hunting at not just the right location, but the right time for those bucks to actually come through your property and walk by a certain tree stand that you're hoping for. Learn how to scout in the off season. It doesn't boil down to just deer trails and rubs. And we're in a great area right there. There's a staging area before they go out to the field, so a lot of rubs in this location. But it doesn't boil down to just buck sign and travel corridors and trails. Really focus on the timing of those bucks when they're actually going to be on your land. Because a lot of times I'm waiting until the peak of the rut to shoot a non-core buck, and I'm making sure that those stands that relate to those bucks are pressure free, that the local deer herd is none the wiser in those locations, not burning those stands out until the right time. I choose and even then, with a non-core buck, I'm waiting till the best weather days, because if he's coming from a mile away, mile and a half, that's why you're getting pictures of him in the middle of the night in the first place, then I'm waiting until that perfect day, because he's not going to move during a 70-degree day in southwest Wisconsin even during the peak of the rut when there's 30-mile-an-hour winds and it's just not the great conditions for him to traveling. I focus on a few cold front days. That narrows it down in that 10 to 14 day period, just to 2 or 3 days that I can expect to go in and shoot him, and lo and behold, you go in, he's there. And because I scouted effectively, identified by trail camera, sign, personal sightings, I know that buck is a non-core or core buck. I'm going at the right time for him based on those scouting strategies. And the timing of when you go hunt that buck and when you choose to decide, when you allow that tree stand to soak, when you choose to hunt a certain tree stand based on a certain mature buck, is really what it boils down to for your off-season scouting. And that's the number one way to identify and pattern a mature buck leading into this coming hunting season this fall.